Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and I can't believe that in the last War Within beta build, they're continuing to buff the spec of Frost Death Knight. For a couple of weeks now, Frost damage, Frost output, and Frost popularity has been exploding, and I feel like at some point when a class gets this popular, at some point when they get this much attention and spotlight, nerfs follow after them. But for some reason, Death Knight has been able to escape them for weeks and weeks on end. This last week's build of beta further empowered some of the hero specs, especially Deathbringer, as well as continuing to improve the spec of Frost and Blood to some degree, and I kind of wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive at some of the recent Death Knight changes that we saw in this week's build. As always, if you guys want to see more regular class videos like these for the War Within beta, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe, but otherwise, let's dive right in. So for some reason, they thought that in this build, they're just going to buff Death Knights even more, especially the spec of Frost starting with the hero talents, mostly the Deathbringer. The Deathbringer changes are going to be only for the spec of Frost. It's already a popular pick for Blood, but they're even making it better for Frost. And I feel like there's so many benefits to Rider of the Apocalypse. I mean, just being able to horse around everywhere is massive, but they're really trying to give you choices for Frost, and Deathbringer became a quickly very popular pick. I'm almost surprised we haven't seen like a massive overall Frost DK nerf so far. I just feel like it's one of those things where if a class shifts these buffs, at some point it comes crashing down. So I feel like Frost nerfs are only inevitable, but for now they're not here. The Exterminate ability, after your Reaper's Mark expires, Frostbringer ability being Reaper's Mark essentially puts like an execute-esque dot thing that stacks up as you deal more Frost or Shadow damage, and once it reaches 40 stacks, or if a target is below a certain threshold, it explodes, empowering your next Obliterate to provide two scythes. One, a single target scythe that goes from like a top-down frontal cleave, and then it's like a cross cleave with a second AoE. So two scythes, one single target, one AoE. The single target scythe damage buff this week got increased by 50%, and the ability is a very satisfying array of all these scythes crashing together, and the damage you can do is actually kind of pretty good. So, like, it's a very satisfying ability, not only visually, but also now with the damage output. 50% more damage to that is huge. Reaper's Mark initial damage ability, like when you initially apply the mark, that has been increased by 300%. A huge portion of Reaper's Mark damage is primarily that stacking element, as well as the maximum value, but like the initial damage, I mean, it's kind of nice because you just have to spend a global applying the mark at its two ruins. So I guess I wanted to make it very similar to that of like an Obliterate in terms of like impact. But also apparently the damage stacking component of Reaper's Mark as well is being increased by 35%. Also another welcome condition. And altogether, I feel like the Deathbringer, the Reaper's Mark ability in particular, plus the entire kit, just overall feels really good to play into. It synergizes with Frost as well as Blood really well. It's not super gameplay intensive, but it provides you a new little window where you can just kind of maximize the damage inside of like your main primary cooldowns, especially last week or week before that, when they changed the cooldown of this ability to 45 seconds baseline, especially with talents like Painful Death, which allows it to deal additional damage, but also Exterminate empowers one additional Obliterate or Mara Rend if you're a Blood Death Knight. And I feel like where they got Deathbringer right now, Painful Death is in a fantastic spot where that's kind of like the staple and what most players play into. You can play into Swift End, which does help cut down the cost of the ability as well as its cooldown, so you can use it once every 30 seconds, but then it starts to desync from the rest of your cooldown, so I wonder if there's a way that could make Swift End just a little bit better. But combining Painful Death with the Reaper's Mark, 45-second cooldown, double exterminates that you get, it feels awesome, and the impact of the ability feels highly visible. When it comes to Rider, we've seen additional nerfs, and this is primarily for the Nazgrim buff that you get. Whenever Nazgrim is out and about, you gain a baseline 3% strength, and additionally for each one you spend, you keep increasing that value by 1%. So instead of starting off at 5%, it starts out at 3%. Not the craziest of nerfs, but still yet another nerf. Overall, with the Rider of the Apocalypse, we saw a ton of different adjustments for this one. First, a few buffs, and then like a bunch of nerfs one after another. So I feel like it's just an additional nerf that I don't think it's going to be enough to water down the power that comes with Rider of the Apocalypse playstyle. Finally, we have a small adjustment for Sun Lan, primarily to one of their key talents, which is Frenzied Bloodthirst. So the main playstyle of Sun Lan is going to revolve around using Death Coils, Epidemics, Death Strikes in order to have a chance to get your Scourge Strike or your Heart Strike to turn into a Vampiric Strike. Vampiric Strike deals pure shatter damage, heals you for a portion of your health, and grants you a stack of Blood Queen, which is fairly easy to achieve with a capstone that allows you to enter Blood Queen kind of mode for a second every time you use Vampiric Blood or Dark Transformation, letting you stack up those stacks fully, and for the most part as Sun Lane, you should be able to maintain all those stacks every single time. Those stacks not only give you haste, but also empower your abilities such as your Death Coil and Death Strike by 3% per stack. This is apparently has been changed and it looks like the tooltip is not adjusted, but apparently it's supposed to go from a 3% to a 4% damage increase, which is a sizable gain, as every single one of those stacks now provides you with plenty additional Death Coil and Death Strike damage. However, for Unholy, I would have loved to see them adjust like Death Coil and Epidemic somewhere in this, just to make sure this serves good single target as well as cleave capability, but maybe that's something they'll adjust in the future. Otherwise, I feel like more Unholy Death Knights will probably spec into the cleave Death Coil build and play into the cleave setup rather than the big AoE setup whenever they can, in order to maximize the full potential if they do end up playing Sun Lane. Then we have the spec of Blood Death Knight with an actual bit of changes, as all tanks across the board are receiving buffs, every single one of them, primarily damage buffs, as well as certain specific key adjustments here and there. And Blood Death Knight is no other. As a spec that gains benefits directly from damage increases with harder hitting death strikes, further amplifying your overall healing, you are receiving an overall 10% damage buff. Now, this just says and reads in Blue Post 10% all damage buff. This, I assume, is maybe counting auto attacks, but not always. Usually they have to specify if auto attacks are included, because auto attacks are actually a huge portion of melee class damage, especially for tanks, since you don't have too many different damage sources. But overall, at 10%, I assume aura ability increase, which is pretty good. If it is 10% overall damage like auto attacks and everything, that's even better, but a decent buff regardless. They did, however, adjust Bone Storm. They wanted to make this ability still retain a lot of its damage and healing value, but they noticed that it was doing a lot of cooldown reduction mechanics, or a lot of cooldown reduction shenanigans rather, for the Dancing Rune weapon ability, because Dancing Rune could be upgraded with the talent of Insatiable Blade, where Dancing Rune weapon not only provides you Bone Shield charges immediately, but also when a charge of Bone Shield is consumed, the cooldown of Dancing Rune weapon is reduced by 5 seconds. Bone Shield charges is something that is part of your basic passive mitigation as a Blood Death Knight. It provides you with additional armor, but melee attacks will consume these charges, so part of the playstyle for Blood Death Knights is to make sure you don't run out of these charges ever. However, Bone Shield charges are a resource like any other, and they do have some uses, such as with Shattering Bone. When a Bone Shield charge is consumed, it shatters, dealing extra shatter damage to all targets. The damage is tripled if you are standing within death and decay. What Bone Storm does is they changed it for this expansion specifically, to instead of consuming your runic power, it instead consumes your bone shields. And the ability will consume all of those Bone Shield charges and will refund them little by little over time. This mass consumption of Bone Shield charges played heavily into cooldown reduction of your Dancing Rune weapon, which allowed you to use Dancing Rune weapon, rotate through a Tombstone as well as a Bone Storm, and have a Dancing Rune weapon back up rather quickly. So this recent change actually adjusted Bone Storm, so instead of consuming 10 Bone Shield charges, it just consumes 5. However, it retains the full power and value that the ability had initially. This change does adjust a couple of things. One, it does end up nerfing the cooldown reduction on your Dancing Rune weapon, but it also consumes less Bone Shield charges, which leaves you less exposed and less armorless, allowing you to maintain even a portion of your basic mitigation abilities, even a little bit. So I guess it's a nerf when it comes to your overall damage and uptime of Dancing Rune weapon, but technically it's kind of a slight survivability buff just because you get to keep more of your armor. It's definitely a trait that I don't think that many Blood Death Knights would enjoy, because cooldown reduction on runic weapon is kind of huge, honestly. But yeah, that mechanic is getting cut down a little bit as of this build. Then we have the spec of Frost Death, which is receiving even more buffs. Abilities such as Glacial Advance and Frost Scythe apparently were not having their global cooldown reduced with haste. So now both of those abilities should scale properly, making them a little bit easier to weave into your overall rotation, especially if you end up playing into a haste heavy builds. Abilities such as Frost Strike saw an 8% buff. Obliterate also another 8% buff. Breath of Sindragosa, which I feel like with this new hybrid dual wielding Death Knight build where you don't even run Breath of Sindragosa, we've seen a lot less Death Knight running it. They wanted to make sure that it still retains relevancy, so they buffed its damage by 12%. percent, but also at the same time nerfing the Shattering Frost, the kind of the build that ended up kind of overtaking Sindragosa, where instead of cleaving enemies down with the Breath of Sindragosa, you're just cleaving with Frost Strikes, which deal more damage per stack of Razor Rice, and then those Frost Strikes that consume Razor Rice cleave onto everybody around you. They're reducing the cleave effect of Shatter Frost from 65% down to 60%. Although the ability still can perform kind of relatively well in sort of huge AoE pools and AoE situations, but they definitely try to see if they can mitigate some of its value. Where if you are going to be going for bigger pulls, where especially if you're not going to be doing them frequently, this is where Breath of Sindragosa I think could actually be a much better option. Putting Breath of Sindragosa, I think, hopefully in a little bit more of a favorable spot going forward. The overall though, with the changes to Deathbringer, Frost is still coming out on top as of this build, and it still maintains to be one of the most, if not literally the most popular melee class over in the beta. You see them in every single dungeon, and the damage they do is ludicrous, especially if you have somebody who spent a couple of hours crafting all of their items to make sure they have the perfect, ideal secondary and primary stats, everything set up to a T, every single gem, and those Death Knights in particular, they're probably doing the most amount of damage imaginable. For the most part, this build focused on further buffing Frost Death Knights, but it did give Unholy Death Knights a little bit of few adjustments, primarily parity for resources, like for example, how Army of the Dead costs a single rune, Erase Abomination will also cost a singular rune. This is again just to make sure that there's parity with the ability when it comes to your rune spending. But also they adjusted the passive of Unholy Blight so that it's a little bit better at applying Virulent Plague to targets around your goal, rather than specifically focusing on your primary target. And for some reason this ability was a little bit more target focused than anything, so if you were seeing the loss of damage for Unholy, this should be fixed as of this recent beta build. But I feel like every single time we see a class receive buffs after buffs after buffs, which is just dreamy, at some point that dream probably goes crashing down after a couple of weeks, and I feel like with Frost Death Knights you should be extra careful. I am personally very excited to see how Frost has developed so far over in the beta, from its hero talents to its basic talents to the playstyle, the options that you have, whether you want to play two-handed Obliterate, dual wield Breath, or something in the middle. I've loved seeing that kind of developed over our time. However, I'm just gonna wait for them to at some point nerf this thing, because I feel like a good thing can never last that long enough, unless you play a class of Mage, of course. But with that being said, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope all of you enjoyed. If you did enjoy this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord, link to that in the description of every single one of these videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts about the Spec Frost. Do you think it's worth banking into as a potential main going forward, or should players be more cautious rather than super optimistic? Let me know all your thoughts, how you feel about all these changes, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.